But you're confident that the decision on ceasefire in Ukraine will completely depend on Vladimir Putin?
Well, no, it takes two sides to agree to a ceasefire. But when I look at long range at Ukraine's position, there are clearly two elements that are critical for Ukraine if Ukraine is going to be able to accept a ceasefire. One is that Ukraine should retain its full sovereignty, its full freedom of decision-making, freedom of action. And the other, and the most difficult one, is that Ukraine clearly is not going to want to accept a ceasefire unless Ukraine has credible guarantees of its security, a real sense of certainty that it has the means to deter Russia from attacking again. And the sort of measures that would be required to give Ukraine that level of security are measures which Putin, I think, will find very hard to accept. So I think that's the critical point in the negotiation. There are a lot of other things that will be involved, a lot of elements that will be on the table. But the crunch point is Ukraine can't have a ceasefire unless the ceasefire gives Ukraine security and the means to prevent a further attack by Russia. And that would require Putin accepting measures that he, at the moment, I think, is very reluctant to accept.
President Zelensky says that Vladimir Putin is afraid of Donald Trump because Donald Trump has the power to stop the war against Ukraine. Do you also believe in that Putin is afraid of Trump?
I don't know whether he's afraid of Trump, but Trump is a bit of an unknown quantity in a way that gives Trump some leverage. I think Putin is probably a little nervous about what Trump might do. None of us know what Trump is going to do, and I suspect that Trump himself probably doesn't know at this point what he's going to do, although he becomes president now in 7 days' time. But he has a range of options. One of his options, which I hope he will look at very seriously, is to increase pressure on Russia. If Trump is going to go into a negotiation with Putin, and Trump has now talked about the idea of having a meeting with Putin, he needs to have leverage. How does he get that leverage? It seems to me there are two obvious ways that Trump gives himself some leverage in a negotiation. One would be to increase American military support for Ukraine. And the other, and I think really important one, would be to increase the pressure on the Russian economy. The Russian economy is the Achilles heel of Vladimir Putin. It is his weak point. It is in trouble. And there is more that could be done to tighten the sanctions on Russia, particularly the sanctions on the export of oil, but also more secondary sanctions to prevent third countries providing all kinds of services for Russia, supplying equipment to Russia that cannot be supplied directly, providing financial services, trading with Russia in different ways. And I think that the Americans have the power, in combination with the Europeans, to put more economic pressure on Russia. And so if I was advising Trump, I would advise him not to rush into a meeting with Putin, but to make sure that before he had any meeting with Putin, he actually had not only a carrot, but a big stick. And if Trump does that, he might have a chance of persuading Putin to give some ground. But without that, if he just goes into a meeting without that level of preparation, I think the meeting will be a failure.
So do you believe that Donald Trump has enough power to force Vladimir Putin to agree with a ceasefire proposal?
No, I don't think Trump is in a position to force Putin or indeed to force Zelensky. Trump cannot just impose a settlement. Putin would, rather than accept humiliating terms from the Americans, Putin would continue the war. And he has the ability to continue it, although he will find it harder and harder to sustain the current level of hostilities. But he would be very determined not to be humiliated by Donald Trump. He has to be able to claim that he has achieved something in return for this huge loss of Russian life and Russian resources that the war has entailed. So Putin has the ability to say no. Trump does not have the ability to force Putin to accept whatever Trump wants.
Even if he sends Ukraine military aid, allows to strike inside Russia, and imposes even tougher sanctions on the Russian economy?
That would increase the pressure on Putin, and I think Trump should do that, because that will give Trump leverage. But it doesn't mean that Putin would, as it were, at that point surrender to Trump. Putin will not surrender to Trump, but it would mean that Trump had a stronger hand to play in a negotiation with Putin. So you can't force Putin, but you need to persuade Putin, and persuade him not by offering him rewards, but by putting more pressure on Putin. That's what Trump needs to do.
But do you believe that it would be possible for Donald Trump to persuade Vladimir Putin about any kind of topic, about a ceasefire? Is it really possible to persuade Vladimir Putin about in any kind of topic?
It's possible. It's not easy. I think it's possible if Putin gets seriously worried that he is not going to make rapid progress in the war, and the progress that the Russians have recently made has been slow, it has not been rapid, and it has been at huge cost in terms of Russian casualties, losing up to 2,000 troops in a single day in order to gain small amounts of territory. And his economy is under extreme pressure. It's not going to collapse, but it's getting worse. And these are factors which will be in Putin's mind. They do give him a reason to look for a way out. It doesn't mean that it forces him to give up, but it does give him an incentive to give up. That's why Trump potentially could have leverage.
How do you see the possible scenario of Putin's endgame, the end of his regime?
There are only three ways his regime could end. One would be if the people close to him mounted a coup against him. That seems to me very unlikely, because he has always been very frightened about his personal security, and he has appointed to all the key positions around himself people who are super loyal to him, but also people who are incriminated in his own corruption and criminality. People who therefore would be vulnerable themselves if Putin fell from power. The second way in which a dictator can be removed from power is if you have a mass revolt of the populace against the dictator. Putin is using such harsh security measures in Russia, murdering and locking up opponents, taking away freedom of expression. It seems very, very unlikely that the Russian people would succeed in rising up against him, and they don't appear to be in a mood to do so. I think they would be frightened of the chaos that would result from that. So, and there is no organized opposition that is even possible in Russia at the moment. So this actually means, sadly means, that the end of the Putin regime has to await the end of Vladimir Putin, who appears to be in good health, is in his early 70s, could live for several more years while his country gets further and further downhill, goes backwards, and weakens, but does not collapse. And I'm afraid that our default assumption must be that Putin will remain in power until the Grim Reaper comes to collect him.
And how do you see the possibility for deputinization after Putin's departure?
The possibility for what?
Of deputinization process.
Deputinization. It will happen. It will happen because Putin has done such damage to his own country. It may not happen immediately. It may not be Putin's immediate successor. I think the most likely successor to Putin will be clearly somebody a bit younger, but somebody who has been groomed by Putin. Critically in Russia, you need to have the support of the security organs, which are immensely powerful. And Putin's successor, therefore, is likely to be somebody from a Putinist orbit. But as you go further down the road, people in Russia are going to realize that Putin has taken the country seriously backwards. You remember that back in 2009, Dmitry Medvedev, who at the time was pretending to be the president of Russia, wrote an article called Go Russia, in which he put the question, should a primitive economy based on raw materials and endemic corruption accompany us into the future? Well, that was 16 years ago. And that's precisely the same question that faces Russia now. And I think that in the post-Putin era, the people of Russia will want once again to modernize their country, to improve their country, not to be seen as a pariah state by the rest of the world, to try to restore a reasonable working relationship with the rest of Europe, to try to be respected in the way that they are not at the moment. In short, they will look back on the Putin era as a disastrous period for Russia that has taken them into this terrible war with Ukraine and that has left them with an economy which still depends heavily on the export of hydrocarbons and other raw materials and on its defense industry, a country which has been remilitarized by Putin, a country in which the standard of living has not improved over the last 10, 12 years, actually has gone backwards. And that's not what the people of Russia will want. So, and they particularly dislike the level of corruption. They're used to corruption in their society. The Soviet Union was deeply corrupt. But the level of corruption under Putin is stratospheric. And I ask myself, has any leader in history stolen more from his people than Putin? And in 20 years' time, that's how the Russians will look back on Putin. At some point between now and then, I think they will make another effort to rejoin the civilized world.
Thank you, Ambassador Lyne, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Well, you're most welcome, and I do wish all the people of Ukraine well. They're going through a terrible period, and I think we in this country and across Europe feel deeply for them and desperately want to see them succeed in this struggle. So thank you very much.